Welcome to the Stone Carvers Guild podcast. Here you will meet a variety of carvers working throughout North America. Drawing on our collective experience, we seek to share knowledge about this ancient art and to do our part to ensure that stone carving will play an important role in built environments for generations to come. So whether you are an experienced carver, new to the craft, or just curious, put on your safety goggles, open up your mind, and welcome to the workshop.
I think that people are coming down on the side of the pneumatic. So I feel like we've had a string of guests.
Wait, what people? Oh, our guests. I thought you meant we were getting comments.
No. Do we have it? Are we getting any reviews yet, Joel? Have we seen? Are there?
No, we should. Yes. We should take this moment though to say, hey, you're listening to the podcast. Be sure to leave us 5 stars. And if it's anything less than 5 stars, just don't leave anything, please.
Yeah, just give us a break. Come on, we're young.
5 stars. If you leave a comment, we may or may not talk about it.
We absolutely will talk about the first comment. The first comment is going to be discussed. It's going to be read. I'll do a reading of it. Like I will do a characterization reading of it. And we will discuss it. So, where is Apple Music the best place, or podcast the best place to juke the stats?
It is. That is the Apple Podcast is kind of the place to leave a comment. So if you're going to leave a comment there, but anywhere you can do it.
Our guest today, however, he only uses hammer and chisel at the very end. So he weighed
He did
that, right?
For the important part, the final detail, right?
Well, yes. I mean, at the end, you got to. At a certain point, you can't think as fast as the pneumatic hammer is operating. That's when you have to turn it off.
So he covered a lot of. Actually, we covered a lot of technique in this. Yeah, but he didn't really directly weigh in on the pneumatic versus hand tool.
Except for that he has made a lifelong choice to use a pneumatic hammer. Other than that,
well, right, but he didn't explain himself very well. That's all I'm saying.
I'm feeling the tension in the studio today. Guys, who is our guest? Who is our guest today? Maybe we should start there.
Oh, right.
Michael Fannin out of Vermont. He has been
surrounded by beautiful stone of all kinds up there, as we'll discuss.
Have either of y'all been to Vermont?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I haven't either.
Not.
He talked about the guild meeting that was in Vermont, and I think I must have missed that one because I don't remember the chowder that his wife made. And that sounded fantastic. So this is it's a fun conversation.
Another veteran member of the guild. And someone that Matthew has met.
Yeah, worked with, in fact.
Yeah. Oh, right. Yep, worked with. Some history there. So he's got lots of interesting things to say.
I really enjoyed this conversation. It was just great to hear about, well, first of all, his unique background and then his appreciation for the guild, which will be fairly evident.
Some good tricks for the letter carvers. Yeah. What did you think about that, Joel?
I'm all about it. I'm all about anytime letter carving, my ears perk up. Oh, yeah. It's so good. Especially as somebody who works in slate. And that's
Do you work in slate a lot as well?
I love slate. A fair amount. Yeah, I vary between different stones. Working a little bit of marble, a little bit of slate, a little bit of granite even. But slate is just such exactly as he says later on, is just such a beauty to behold.
And how is you've been more intensely letter carving lately, right? How's the how's the building the business going?
Oh, it's going. Taxes, taxes. No, it's fine. There's just it's always a new adventure. Just started on a new headstone. Life is good. So yeah. Well, my life is good.
Yeah, death is good. Death is good.
Anyway,
it's going to be a nice headstone. Let's just say that. Nice hand-cut V letter. Oh, cool. Beautiful.
And how about you, cool. Bethany? How are things going up in Washington?
Oh, things are going all right. I had a workshop actually at my studio that Patrick Plunkett taught.
Is that what this photo masonry. That is your avatar is? You're teaching some children?
No, that is not the masonry workshop. Normally I don't teach 6-year-olds. Yeah, but Patrick came out and he taught a masonry workshop, and it was really good, and I learned a bunch of stuff, and so that's the news from my studio lately.
Cool.
New stuff.
How's Texas?
Yeah. We're good. Yeah. We're good. The weather has been fantastic, and pivoting in the process of pivoting to a new project. So a lot of drafting and client time, conversations, talking about different things. So it's the ebb and flow, but it's always nice when when it gets in the cool months, if I can spend some of the time inside, that's always very nice. So just getting ready for the spring, the beautiful April spring.
I hear April is wonderful in Vermont, and on that note, let's get to the conversation, shall we?
Absolutely. Michael Fannin is a charter member of the Stone Carvers Guild and is committed to preserving the lineage of our trade. His studio is in Vermont. He has been working there for a number of years. How many years have you been working there, Michael?
It'll be 50 years this year.
Wow, did you get started in Vermont?
Yes, I did.
Were you in the granite industry, or was it?
No, I kind of accidentally got started. I came here to pick apples, and after that was over with, I was looking for some kind of work and walked into the Vermont Marble Company in Proctor, Vermont, and didn't really know what they did there. But they hired me on as a beginner. Since I'd been to art school, they thought they had some potential there. And I remember walking the back door of the building shed and coming upon Renzo Palmerini sitting in the lap of this enormous statue that was going down to Washington, D.C. I think it's in front of the Commerce Department now. Sitting in the lap of that statue, carving his beard. And I was just stupefied. I just realized right then and there, I just walked into my future, my life, my trade, everything.
Wow. What was it called? The Marble Company?
It was the Vermont Marble Company. At one time, it was the largest marble company in the world. It was enormous.
Wow.
They were responsible for a lot of the big government buildings down in Washington. In fact, we were still working on a couple of those back in the early 70s when I started there. We fabricated the exterior for the Dirksen Senate Office building. We did restoration work and replacement for the Capitol building and the Library of Congress. A lot of big jobs like that. But by the time I started in the 70s, the business had diminished significantly from the century before. But it was still operating. It still had some potential there. And I worked there for 4 years until 1978 when Vermont Marble was bought out by a company called Omnia, which is a subsidiary of Plustoffer out of Switzerland. And they bought the company and all its land holdings and mineral rights, and their business they were in the business of grinding marble into dust and using it as an industrial filler. And once they acquired the building shed and everything from the company, they tried to automate everything. And over the next 3 or 4 years, that was Omnia's business model, was automation. I mean, they made promises when they bought the company that they would keep the building shed open. They just didn't happen to mention that there wouldn't be any men necessary in the building shed to do the work.
Wow.
So you weren't drawn to the marble grinding industry quite as romantically?
No, hardly. I mean, I left there in '78 when they when they bought the company. They shut down the monument division right away, and I was out of work, and that's when I struck out on my own. I was young enough to actually kind of roll with the punches, you might. And I took up masonry, and then that led me into building restoration. But in all the 50 years since, I have been doing carving work for architecture, a lot of monumental work, a lot of building restoration.
What was your early training like? How was the knowledge passed along to you?
I'm glad you asked that question because it was something I wanted to bring up. The shop in Proctor was organized like an Italian shop would be. All the carvers there had come over from Italy, people like Pomerini, Tonelli, Carusi, and they were basically from the Pietrasanta region, and they set up their carving operation there at the company pretty much the way it would be set up in Pietrasanta. So you might say that I didn't go to Italy to be trained in the Italian tradition, but Italy came to me.
And what is that tradition like? I mean, what's involved?
I guess it's basically they weren't there to train you, but they couldn't keep you from watching them. And you would start out at the lowest level of employment there at the company. I started out as a hand rubber and finisher on the finish work, and ran machinery, and I worked there for months and months before they ever let me pick up a hammer and chisel. And that was to become a cutter, what you call a cutter, which would be doing geometric cleanup work where saws and carve running machines couldn't reach into corners for moldings and whatnot, and doing the tops of monuments and things. They were the geometric carving work. And while I'm on the subject of cutters, I want to mention that they are, to me, like the unsung heroes of the cathedral constructions in ancient times. I mean, the cutters, they were responsible for making every block just perfect, so that when you built that structure up to several hundred feet in the air and you wanted to put those boss stones in, they may have like 6 or 8 different facets that had to fit right perfectly into the arches. Boy, if the cutters didn't do their work right, that building wouldn't go together. And if they made a mistake, I know in Germany, they would parade them through town on a rail. They call them a bender, and they would humiliate them in public if they messed up a block. So the sculptors always got the glamour. They got to ornament the buildings. But as you know, sculpture, it's more, you have a lot more variability in sculptural either ornamentation, whether figurative or faux foliage, whatever. You know, in nature, things aren't exactly straight or the perfect art. And so there's a little variation going on. When you're doing cutting work and you're doing it by hand, you have to get it just perfect if everything's going to get together. So let's hear it for the cutters that did so much for the world. So after you progressed at the company, if you managed to cover the cutting work well enough, they would let you try to do some lettering work and engraving work. And that was, you'd be called a carver then. You get a little bit more pay. And I did that for about 3 years. And then began to duplicate statuary, where they let me try out, duplicating from the plaster models. We had a whole library of archetypical plaster models there at the company. And we'd occasionally get orders for these things. And so I got a chance to start using the pointing machine and, working from the model. And at the same time, throughout all this, I was doing my own modeling for models and showing work in galleries between here and Boston and whatnot. And that pretty much brings us up to 78 when the company got bought out and I went out on my own.
So what was the purpose of having the shop set up where the knowledge was guarded so carefully?
Well, I think Joel and I were talking about this the other day, and the interview you did with the Reagans, they talked about it there too, how generally the sculptors in these shops in Italy and here, they guarded their knowledge. The remarkable thing about the Reagans is that they were willing so early to share the knowledge and train the young people and bring them into the trades. And that's almost unheard of. Mm-hmm. And when I worked at the company, I was allowed to work in the immediate vicinity of the sculptor. So I watched them day in and day out. And it was basically a monkey see, monkey do kind of thing. Uh-huh. There's a really old used up phrase in Italy where they talk about the stone carver steals his trade. Mm. And that means it isn't handed to him. He just kind of, sneaks it over the transom, you might say, and picks it up through a monkey see, monkey do kind of relationship. And that's how I teach students when I have them now. I bring them into the shop and I say, just watch me, and then you do what I do, and then we'll see how it goes. Mm. But in the day when I worked at the company, I kind of resented the old Italians being like that. And then later on in life, I realized that it was born out of an insecurity where many of them had gone through the deprivations of the Second World War, and they were insecure about money. Mm-hmm. And they were insecure about the position, and that's why they guarded so closely. And I can't resent them for that. I mean, I still managed to educate them.
No, I really appreciated that insight, because as we were discussing about how Bob was mentioning that he had just stood out to him, he had kind of a bad early experience with somebody he wished he could learn from initially, and then he just made it a note and kind of a personal mission to teach anybody he could come across. And I think it's interesting how we probably get one side of that coin on this, because this is a group of people who are wanting to share their craft and willing right. and ready and able to. And so it's interesting to hear that, that perspective from you, Michael. Thank you.
Well, that's not uncommon. What I went, not uncommon at all.
Mm-hmm. But that's how you approach, you said in your shop, that is the approach that you take?
Well, now that I'm older and more secure and I'm getting ready to retire, I'm definitely more interested in training people. Mm-hmm. And I have to admit, early in my career, I wasn't thrilled about training people. Mm-hmm. I adopted the same kind of attitude that the old carvers adopted towards me. I'm sorry to say it, but I'll admit it. That's the way I was.
Oh, okay. Huh.
You didn't want to go back to apple picking?
Apple picking had its charms, but no. I like working with a roof over my head too. Really loved what I did. It really gave my life significance and meaning for me that I might not have had otherwise.
So, but you said that you went to art school before?
Well, I did. I went to the Dayton Art Institute for a while, but what they were promoting in the art schools was not what they expected in the shop, what the Italians expected. Our school the emphasis was on individual expression, mm-hmm. and in the shop, that's not what was going on at all. It was, here are the blueprints, here is the model, this is what the architect expects, and you can take your individual expression and just put it in your pocket and just leave it there. Mm-hmm. So it's a different world. It's a production world. It isn't something that I would call really the art world. It is more the expert craftsmen of the world doing their trade there in the shop.
Yeah.
I don't mean to jump ahead on the topic or the conversation, but how has your perspective on kind of the marriage of those two changed over time from, great expression from an artistic point of view versus kind of following the guide, not expressing in the work? What's the balance? Is there a balance?
I think there could be. I certainly respect a true artist who can design things, just they have their own concepts and manage to get them out and get them down in a model or in drawings and go from there. I'm not that person. I'm not I'm not really oriented towards being an artist so much as I'm being towards a craftsman. Mm.
I think it's really something that gets lost sometimes is the idea of learning the techniques before you begin expression. That training in like you were saying about the cutters, getting that process down is key to being a good carver, even though once you become a carver, you can color out of the lines a little bit more. But if you don't know the basics, it's real easy to get lost.
that's something I try to emphasize with the students I have had over the years. I really do enjoy teaching. I'm just doing more of it now than I used to. If you can learn the primary techniques and make it a practice, then it gives you more freedom to do whatever you might want to do in your artistic expression, right? You'd have to, if you want to do figurative work, you ought to learn how to model the figure and how to copy the model. And I used to have these students that would come in and they wanted to be little Michelangelos right away. They want to do heads and faces and whatnot. And I would suggest that they, work from a model, and some of them just wouldn't. And they were usually the frustrated students, and you'd find the remains of their efforts laying on the ground out in the parking lot where they pitched them off, and throwing them out because the faces looked so foolish and primitive, that, it was embarrassing to behold. So, to learn the basic foundational skills, I think is very important to becoming a good artist. There's a lot of people that try to put the cart before the horse, and their results generally aren't very good.
Mm-hmm. In the progression that you described in the shop, you said that you would do the stone cutting and then lettering and then duplicating statuary from a plaster model. Where would relief carving fall in there? Or was that?
That is the neither world that carvers generally took care of. It was the place that I've been fascinated with all the years that I've been doing this, and I suppose that's where my modeling strength really is in the realm of relief. It's three-dimensional form. It's the suggestion of three-dimensional form that hasn't quite been released from the background field that it's living in. It's kind of two-dimensional-ish, three-dimensional-ish, but somewhere in the middle there. And a lot of that comes from doing memorial work. A lot of the ornamentation on monuments is in relief.
So then was that something that you taught yourself when you started working on your own, or where did you?
Well, I watched the guy who was the main carver at the shop, who was a pretty remarkable fellow named Pete Fox, one of the few American-born carvers there. And I really learned how to actually do lettering and stuff and make money at it. There's some tricks you ought to learn if you're going to actually get the process done quick enough to make it profitable. Of course, that's what your employer is interested in, your employer. And they're watching you every step of the way. And if you're not performing at a certain speed and level, well, then they're not going to get moved up into the ranks of the sculptor or anything. It was a demanding environment where you had management watching you all the time. If you made a mistake, you didn't get another opportunity to make that mistake. You would stay right there, and that's as high as you would go in the hierarchy. You would be stuck at being a cutter or carver or whatever for the rest of your career.
For forever, or for like a week, or for a year, or?
No. I don't recall. I never got any second chances. I didn't see anybody else get any either. They found where what they level was in your skills, and that's where you'd stay.
Wow, sounds intense.
It was, but it was a terrific environment to learn in. That's for sure. I think Kim Cannon's similar background, where he started out at the bottom there at St. John the Divine and learned all the the really basic techniques. I think it's a great practice to have if you're going to have a well-rounded education in this. And then if you wanted to take what you've learned out into the real world, like I did, and operate there, well, I couldn't think of a better foundation. I mean, all those weeks and weeks of drilling and broaching anchor holes for the Library of Congress, just running the drill and broaching them out. I mean, week after week after week. I look back at it now and think, well, that was the price I paid for my education,
What's broaching an anchor hole? Can you explain what that is?
Well, most modern stone facades are done in veneers. They could be 4-inch veneers, they could be 2-inch veneers, but we were doing 4-inch veneers for the Library of Commerce. Library of Congress is typical. So nowadays, the stone still stands on itself, but there's an inner wall that's made out of masonry that has usually stainless steel anchoring systems in it. So there are clips that come out and clip into the stone that you're fabricating. So you're making the holes for these clips right into.
Oh, okay.
It's probably a real handy machine now to do that, but back 50 years ago, we just did it all by hand.
Wow.
And so you could adjust these clips from the background so that you could line those stones up perfectly vertical and set them on each other, and so they were all clipped together. And it's a great system. It works well. In the old days, I have to point out, the old veneers, I've seen them done on buildings here in Vermont, where they do veneers. There's a bank downtown where they did a veneer that was only 1 inch thick. It was all vert antique, which is that beautiful green serpentine that comes out of Vermont. Very hard to work with, like glass. And they put that whole thing together with brass pins that would be stone to stone. So it would be standing on each other, each stone going up. There would be a void behind the stone to the brick wall. That's the basic building. And they would throw plaster gobs up against that back wall, that backing, and the wall that was still wet. They would set up the veneer to where it was perfectly plumb and level. And then they would put these little brass pins in that were anchored to the wall and let that set up. And then they go up another coursing. So that whole veneer on that building was just put together with plaster and brass pins, and it's held up with no joints, by the way. This is, I forget what the term is for that, but there was no joints between the stones. There was a little slime-coated plaster between them. But that whole thing has stood for 150 years, and it's just as stable and strong as what it ever was. It's remarkable what the old-timers did with the most primitive materials.
Wow.
So you mentioned techniques to make lettering profitable.
I am intrigued.
I'd love to know more.
Tell us your secret. I wouldn't have given away a long time ago, No, well, what you do is you've got a line of letters that you have to carve. You're carving V-sunk letters. So what you do is you'll go down through that line of letters and make all the cuts that come in from the right side to the center, do all those cuts, then turn that stone around or walk yourself around the stone and do all the cuts coming back from the other direction. You kind of work it like eating corn on the cob. You work it in a spiral like that. You'll find out that rather than doing one letter at a time, you can do several letters in the time that would take you to do one if you're doing it the slow way. Tricks like that were ways to speed up the process and keep it profitable for everybody.
Well, interesting. Any other tricks?
I think I've revealed enough.
That is
I'll probably get in trouble for this.
That's a really good technique, and it's really great for running moldings too, like egg and dart.
Oh, sure. Anything repetitive. I do the same thing when I'm doing column capitals.
Right.
When I do it, I'll turn it upside down and work it all upside down, and I will anchor my rack for my corning machine on one facet, and then as I go around, I'll just move that machine right around the stone and do the same point on each facet, and then go back around, set a different point with the corning machine, go around, do it again. And, to try to do one facet, one side at a time would be counterproductive, really, when you think about it.
Right.
Oh, I hope everybody's making notes here, the people that are going to be listening to this. So I'm giving away the keys to the kingdom here. So
the money's just going to come pouring in here. Yes.
I'll never pour it in. But
I'm curious about, when you went out on your own, what was that like? What were some of the early commissions that you got? And
okay, my early commissions when I went out on my own were replacing chimneys from the roof up. There was I couldn't get any carving work. This was back before the internet and everything. I remember I did huge mailings. Every year I'd mail out promotional pamphlets to every monument dealer on the East Coast, and never got a single job for many of those mailings. Wow. The monument industry was not really interested in one-off custom work. They were interested in what was the granite blocks that were sitting out on the lot, and that's what they would that we would sell. If anybody came to them and asked them to do a custom job, they say, well, that kind of handwork just isn't done anymore. So there's no point in even doing it. So I think in 50 years, I've gotten 2 referrals from monument dealers, and they were both for architectural work. They weren't for monument work. Well, there was that. So I had to make a living somehow. So I took up masonry, and I basically taught myself that as well. But I still worked with a lot of Italians in that industry. And then that led to reproducing and replacing architectural ornamentation on buildings, where a building may have deteriorated part of it, where there was architectural ornamentation, and I would cast what I could from the deteriorated area. I would remodel it to where I could use it for a model, and then I would duplicate that and then set it in the building. And so the masonry experience really gave me a lot of opportunity to learn how to set stone, learn how to build a stone, how to deal with contractors, how to deal with architects. It was really a real-world experience. And that was actually the most profitable thing I did over the years. I've done a lot of monument work, especially since the internet came along, and I could cast the net far enough around the country to get just carving work. And that's pretty much when I retired from doing masonry and building work. That was about 20 years ago, except for the job that Matthew came and helped me out on down in Boston, where we restored a mansion down there a couple of years back. And I was kind of persuaded to come out of retirement to do that, and I'm glad I did. That was the icing on the cake of a long career of repairing buildings. That was just a beautiful, beautiful old mansion. The second most expensive piece of single-family real estate in the city of Boston, down in the old Back Bay.
I was talking to Joseph about that. I never had any, because like when I got there, the scaffolding was up, and there was like Viz Queen all over the scaffolding because it was the dead of winter, and I never had a sense of what that building looked like. I saw everything from like about 8 inches away. Through goggles, and it was sandstone, so we were wearing ventilation masks.
Oh yeah.
But I would love to go and see that building, because I'm sure it was a remarkable edifice. But I don't have any sense.
Well, I noticed that Joel was asking for me to supply some photographs of my work experience, and I didn't have much, but I think I will send along maybe a before and after picture of the entranceway of that building, and maybe a larger picture of the building if I can.
Yeah, that'd be
cool. That as well.
Cool.
It was a beautiful piece of architecture. It was done in brick and a limestone that came out of Nova Scotia. It was fun to source the material for that building. And I got...
it wasn't sandstone.
It was a sandstone. It wasn't a limestone. That's why you had to wear those masks. Because of the...
Right.
And that came out of Wallace Quarry up in Nova Scotia. And those people up there were so good to us. They found an area down in the face of that quarry where they could actually find the same shade and color of the stone that they were using on that building 100 years before.
Wow.
And they really went out of their way to supply that for us. It was tricky getting it across the border and all the fuss we had to go through, but we got maybe 10 tons of that went into that building.
Wow.
And it made a big difference because all the stone matched up beautiful.
Yeah.
Wow.
And what I also wanted to point out is in the guild over the years, we'd always talked about having an event where we all got together and we all did a public sort of carving and to promote ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that we've had moderate success at that, but nothing great. But with this job down in Boston, we brought in, we had 5 carvers and myself, mostly guild members.
Mm-hmm.
And we did this thing that was just a showplace for our art. I know the architects down there were paying really close attention because we were doing things old school. We weren't using restoration mortars or precast concrete. We were cutting out stone and replacing stone with original stone and carving those same dimensions and everything. we basically refinished that place by hand. The surface we took down an average of maybe an eighth of an inch, 3/16, just ground it all down because they'd made really poor effort at restoring the building floor, where they'd covered it with sealers, masonry sealants, and that trapped all the moisture in the building, made things worse, but left us with this eggshell kind of thickness of crud on the original stone that we had to grind off. Mm-hmm. And so we did it old school, and we showed them how it was done down there in Boston.
So I interrupted your pivot to talking about the guild, and the original founding of the guild.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Tell us.
That was interesting how that worked out, because we were basically competitors.
Right.
We found each other because we were all advertising the same kind of trade journals and stuff, and it was interesting that we got together because we're basically competitors, and we kind of overrode that, thinking that we might be better off if we kind of combined our influence and promoted ourselves with a guild. We didn't do the things that the guilds did historically. We didn't set a labor rate. We didn't indoctrinate. We didn't haze people into the organization or anything. I look at the guild now more as like a fraternity of carvers that had benefited from their association with each other. Like when I was doing the job in Boston, I could call on qualified people like you and Kincannon and Simpson and the rest, and I'd know that I could get them on the job. They knew what they were going to do, and didn't need a whole lot of direction or education, and so we could bring in high level help. I've gone down to Washington and worked with Malcolm and other people in the guild I've worked with, brought them to Vermont to work with me. And so when you need, you can't necessarily afford to keep these guys in your shop 24/7. It sure is nice to have them in your pocket when you can pull them into a job, and you can get it done because they can help you out. It's been really worth being a member of. I've been on the board off and on for years. I've hosted a couple of meetings, one here in Vermont and then one down at the Art Students League. I think it's important for people on the board to try to host a meeting at some time or another. It's an interesting experience. It's like herding cats, trying to get all these stone carvers to be in one place at the same time. But when I brought them up to Vermont, it was foliage season. It was just beautiful. I took them up to Barrie, Vermont, to Hope Cemetery, which is a show place for the carver's art. In Vermont we have granite, we have slate, we have marble. Just happen to have all these stones within 100 miles of each other, and so that's what brought the carvers here. That's what brought the industry here. And and when we had our dinner, when we had hosted the dinner for that meeting, I think my wife made lobster corn chowder with filet mignon, and I don't think anybody's managed to beat the menu we had for that meeting in all these years.
Oh man.
Yeah,
Wendy set the bar high.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
How old is the Vermont industry? You were talking about all the different stones there. When did they start quarrying there?
I think the original carving work started out kind of simultaneously, the stone and marble kind of simultaneously. I mean, the slate you could break off the hillsides, and they were an early memorial material. And then the earliest marble quarries, they were black powdering ledge off of hillsides, and then dressing that down by hand to do monuments, the old tablet stone monuments. And all this was happening just after the Revolutionary War period. It was all brought together and industrialized shortly after the Civil War, when people like Redfield Proctor bought up all the small holdings in the county and brought them all under the domain of the Vermont Marble Company. And that drove the railroad industry. That's why the railroad moved into Vermont. That also drew heavy industry like the satellite companies that supplied equipment for the marble industry, like House Scale and some of the machining companies that made the rubbing beds, the carborundum beds, and all the machinery used for the fabrication. And so it was the thing that drove industry into Vermont. And well, it's all been somewhat diminished because of marble kind of fell out of favor as a monument material. Granite we all took a wicked hit when China got most favored nations trading status. That was a big kick in the teeth. So there are still some the remains. You still see it up in places like Barrie and Rutland, but it's sad to go to places like Barrie and see how the whole structure, the whole social structure has changed, and not for the better. I mean, and in Proctor and Barrie back in the day when they were company towns, you basically married into this business. You were apt to, marry a local girl, become part of a local family. It was all very family oriented, and that's the way it felt, which is great. And then after Vermont Marble shut down, and after Barrie took such an economic hit, they're just kind of the shadow of the social structure what they had before.
Is there still any marble industry there?
Yes, there is, but it's like I said, it's very diminished. There's a couple of mom and pop shops around doing a little business. The Danby Imperial Quarry, which is bought by them, it still does fabricating, but it's strictly machined work for building veneers and building work, and that's sublet to an Italian company. The name escapes me right now. Who set up a mill right in the quarry? I mean, the quarry is enormous. It's the largest underground marble quarry in the world, and it's all laid out horizontally into the mountain rather than going vertically down into the ground, which 90% of the quarries go vertical, and they quarry around the central column that holds up the quarry. And the Danby Imperial, they go horizontally into the mountain, and they have, hundreds of acres in different levels under Dorset Mountain that they still mine. Most of that stone goes over to Europe, and it's sold by the Italians. So there's no more hand carving.
Goes over to Europe? They take
I think
marble
that's
and
where most of their. Well, it's an Italian company that's running it, so they have. I imagine that most of their sales are over in Europe and other parts of the world.
But don't they have their own marble? I'm trying to wrap my head around this. Like, why would they take? I thought the marble, like the good marble, was in Italy.
No, it's in Vermont.
Now you're talking down the Vermont marble.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're right.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean that.
No, and I'll explain the difference to you and the different virtues. I mean, Vermont marble is a good durable marble for building work, exterior work, monumental work. But the crystals in Vermont marble are about the size of the head of a pin, a push pin.
Okay.
The crystals in Italian marble are the size of the point of the pin. So you have greater malleability and strength in the Italian marble. You can get finer detail. Whereas it would be more appropriate for portrait work, fine, detailed interior carving work. If I ever get a portrait job, and I've done a few, I always go for the Italian marble. It's very hard to find in this country. You can find veneers in Italian marble. It's very hard to find cubic Italian marble, and that's why so many of the people in our guild have to go to Italy to buy the marble if they're going to use Italian marble. Back during the Kennedy administration, there was some kind of feud between the Proctors and the Kennedy family and there was a tariff. There was a tariff war of some kind, and we ended up losing. And the Italians, well, no, I guess we ended up winning, but the Italians couldn't import the cubic stuff over here at a profit the way they did before, so they just stopped doing it. So Italian marble and cubic is very rare.
Huh. Wow.
Every little piece I find of it, no matter how small, I hang on to. It's a precious material to me.
Wow.
So of those materials in Vermont, what do you have a preference of what you like to work?
As far as doing monument work and getting nice fine detail, I like working in slate, and that's really been the bulk of my monument work in the last 20 years. I'd say 80% of it has been in slate.
What do you like about slate?
You can the light doesn't get lost into it. You know, you're working marble; it's so opalescent that it's difficult to really focus on the surface sometimes, especially when your eyes start getting bad like mine have over the years. So when you're carving marble, there's all sorts of tricks to make it capture the light. For instance, you wouldn't want to polish a statuary done in marble. You'd want to hone it. Whereas if you polish it, it'll reflect the light. It'll both absorb and reflect the light, so it's hard to see the surface. It's much better to have a rasp surface or a honed surface on anything carved in marble. Slate, of course, doesn't absorb light like that, and you can see the contrast of where your chisel has been. It'll be lighter than the surface that you're working, so it's easier to see what you're doing, and you can get some really fine detail with slate. It's persnickety, you know, it can be marred, it can be scratched. If it's unmolested, the surface will hold up for hundreds of years. And if it's funny, and Matthew a carver would know what I'm talking about here, where with slate, you can run your chisel right off the edge of what you're carving and you don't break out the edge.
Oh, really?
Whereas with marble, you run that chisel to the edge and you break the edge out.
Yeah, right.
So it works differently. It's easy to work when you're working on the face of the stone, but if you have the slate, you know how the slate is put together like a sandwich, you know, layer upon layer upon layer. If you're working the edge where all the layers meet, it's very difficult to carve. If you're working on the flat surface where it would be the head of the material, then it's much easier to carve. So it's a little strange, you know. It's different from marble.
How thick can you get slate? Like, can you? I just associate it with being super thin.
Well, generally, it is. I've worked on slate that was upwards of a foot thick before, but the problem with slate is 90% of what comes out of the quarry is scrap. It's unusable, which is why you see these big mountains of scrap around the slate quarries. That also drives the cost of material way up into the stratosphere. It's the most expensive stone to work with that comes out of Vermont.
So there's just a thin strata that's the grain is tight and usable. Is that the issue? That
it comes out in a shattered form, you know. It isn't sawed out of the mountain the way the marble is. It's basically blasted out of the quarry. And so you get these rough, turtle-looking, monstrous boulders that they'll bring out of the ground. And then they'll start cutting that down with 6-foot saws in the mill to get it squared off and everything. Then they're liable to find all kinds of faults in that and throw out a large percentage of that material. So eventually you'll get down to something you can use. But you can imagine that you're pretty well limited to the size that you can actually get out of the ground and use. I've seen some slate pieces that we'll say, like for the flooring of the cathedral down in Washington, and the Modern Art Museum. Those are 4-inch thick, and they were about 4 foot by 2 foot. That's a big piece of slate. That's unusual. A slate pool table is like 5-7 feet long. That's really about as large an area you can find. That's a big piece of slate. Not necessarily a thick piece of slate, but a large surface area. And the virtue of using slate for a pool table is it never warps or bends, so it's always nice and flat. You see it in the cemetery. You see it in the cemeteries. You can let those slate monuments, the tablet stones, if perchance they did decide to heave and tip, they never warp. They'll just lay right down on the ground eventually. Whereas marble, if it's at an angle, it's only 2 inches thick over time, it'll gradually start to warp.
Really?
And you'll see that if you don't reset those stones when it's necessary. There's always a certain amount of maintenance necessary for this old colonial cemetery.
I was going to ask what your experience with how slate weathers out in some of those very old cemeteries and such on the East Coast where you are.
Oh well, like I mentioned before, the surface holds up terrific. You can go down to Boston to the burial grounds down there that where some started up in the late 1600s, and the slate is still legible. You can read it. A lot of that slate came over as ballast on ships back in the day before it was even quarried in this country. And like I said, if it's unmolested, if it isn't scratched or marred or somebody's vandalized it, it'll pretty much hold up indefinitely. Rarely do you get delamitation vertically through the stone if it's gone through the milling process and they've looked for faults that would hold water. Well, this is how we used to test the marble too. You get it wet and then you blow it off with a hose. And if there's still water under the surface holding on there and coming out after the surface water had evaporated, you know you had a potential fault there. So that's all winnowed out in the milling process. So by the time I'd get a piece of slate to do a monument with, it was good and solid. And I can go back, and I do occasionally check on my old work here and there and everywhere, and it's held up very well in the 50 years I've been doing it.
The chisels that you use for slate, do you use carbide tip or do you use like a steel that's been tempered?
I do use carbide, but I shave it down to a much sharper blade-like angle than what you would use for marble. And of course, if you're going to do granite and you're pounding up and down on it, you're going to have an even more truncated angle on your chisel point. The old antique slate chisels were really, really sharp and narrow. But I use carbide chisels because I use carbide machines and pneumatic hammers, and I just make sure that it's sharpened right down to like almost a blade kind of thickness, and that'll slice right through there good.
How often do you find yourself sharpening your chisels? Because I've asked that, and we get varied responses.
Not too often with the slate because it's nice and soft.
Sure.
Marble more often, like during the day, you'd be sharpening maybe once during the day. Granite constantly trying to keep those granite chisels. I don't even want to call them sharp. They're almost like hatchets. It's a different process. I mean, slate and marble is so delicate, and then granite is like an exercise in demolition. You're just standing on that hammer, the biggest hammer you can find, straight up and down, just pounding on that stuff. It's all coming up in your face like a grenade. It's brutal. When I left the marble company, I went up to Barry and worked in granite for a little while and did not like it at all. And I discovered that the guys who were trained up there working in granite did not like working in marble at all. They didn't like all the work and how delicate it was and how easy it was to break. So I bought up some of the best marble I brought home. I bought up in Barry that was just scrap that they didn't even want to use.
Oh, really? Oh.
And do you work mostly with pneumatic tools?
Yeah. Until you get down to the very, very finest detail, then you pick up the hammer and chisel, the small chisels, and work at that. I kind of often wondered that it must have been a more sociable experience back in ancient times when all the stone carvers were in a shop and they were all carving by hand, and so you'd hear this peck, 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 peck all day long. But you could talk to each other,
Yeah.
You're so isolated in a busy, modern, industrialized shop that you don't get that kind of social experience. And at the Vermont Marble Company, we shouted at each other, and then usually, using our hands to describe what we wanted. It was so loud in there, and there were so many different languages being there.
Oh.
So that was how we managed to get around the language barrier. Is talking with our hands. You'd be surprised how quick you can pick up and make yourself understood just using gestures and whatnot.
I'm guessing certain words more than others, maybe. Or
yeah.
Well, I have a question that I asked Patrick about his hat, and you also have a hat that every time I see you, you're wearing that hat. What's the story behind your hat?
Well, everybody has to promote themselves if you're an independent carver, and you have to establish an identity. And so people might forget your name, but you can wear the same hat all the time. They can always say, "Oh, the little guy with the engineer's hat on." So that's kind of been my badge of identity. I suppose you could use anything to do this to get the same effect, but I guess that's the whole idea behind that. And Patrick's hat is actually more utilitarian than mine, and the paper hat, the classic paper hat, which Tom Reedy taught me how to wear, and that's what we wore at the Marble Company. That was your sign of being a carver. Because with a hat like mine, you have the bill in front, so you constantly have to turn it around when you're working. Otherwise, chips come up, bounce off the bill, and end up in your eye.
Yep. Yeah.
Which brings me to the Italians, how they got the marble chips out of each other's eyes.
I don't.
So this is an exercise in faith. I remember I'd get a chip of marble in my eye, and Palmerini would take a pencil and wrap a little piece of tissue around the end of it, tell me to hold still and reach in there with that pencil tip and get that piece out of my eye.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. Now, if they were jealous of you and didn't want you to proceed in that career, they had the perfect opportunity there to put you right out of business.
Yeah, they could just say, well, he moved. He flinched.
Yeah, don't move. Yeah. And it was and if you bang yourself with a hammer, you use a coping tool doing rock face or something. And this happened to everybody. Everybody began there, and was working that. But, you'd slam yourself on the hand with a 2-pound hammer, and they would just laugh and laugh and laugh. They'd come over and they sprinkle a little marble dust on it, and you go down and get it x-rayed and find out you broke it. It was just kind of the rite of passage there.
Oh, my goodness.
I do remember, early on, just grabbing dust and just putting it in my wounds.
I
mean, it's common. Actually, it coagulates quickly.
Yeah.
So,
no, it never hurt me. That's for sure.
Seems. Yeah, I always like to try to get something that was right off the stone, not on the ground. I didn't want to get.
Oh yeah, the dust is right on the surfaces. Yes, indeed. That's prime dust there.
Yeah, it's hygienic. It's super hygienic.
Not the stuff you cough up or pick out of your nose at the end of the day.
No, none of that.
Oh man, this conversation. This is good.
Glamorous, the stone carving.
Well, Michael, we really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
Well, it's my pleasure. I'm glad I had the opportunity to do it. I think it's terrific what you're doing. You're getting an historic record from people who are still carrying on the historic tradition. So this is all good. It's good for the guild, and I think you guys have been doing a fine job.
Thanks. Do you have any last advice for all the people who are listening to this, who are just getting started and learning the craft?
That want to be a stone carver?
Advice for young carvers? Yeah.
So it's not too late to run.
Yeah. Get into the marble grinding industry.
It's been wonderful doing it, but it's always a challenge, and it does come at a certain cost. I mean, I don't have much hearing left, not much eyesight left. I've got all, you're prone to injuries and stuff, and so it does. And it modifies the way you think, the way you view the world. I think that's for the better. I mean, we could get into the whole psychology of what goes on while you're carving and how that's not necessarily the way that you view the world all the time. It's a certain, something you have to learn. So it changes you. It has an impact on you, for better and worse, But I think, from my experience, it's been well worth it. I'm very, very glad that I had an opportunity to do this with my life.
Yeah, it's really an amazing craft, but it is a long haul, and I think that's something that sometimes younger carvers don't realize, that it's a long haul. Get ready.
We were lucky that we were trained. We were lucky that we were trained in an industrial environment. We were actually getting paid to be there and learn our trade that way. For somebody who just wants to be a stone sculptor, out of the clear blue, it's hard to reinvent the technique and the process. When I have students, I try to get the fundamentals into them within a week or so, and at least I have the opportunity to keep them from adopting some bad habits too.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just tell them that it's a practice. If you practice and you keep practicing and make a habit of practicing, you'll get better. It just takes practice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What's that? I think so. Episode 1 with Joseph Kincannon is something about a tortured soul that most stone carvers are.
And blind and deaf as well.
Yeah. Oh, we got a lot of that going on. You get to my age. Yeah.
But loving life.
But good hats. Good hats in this industry.
Yeah. All right.
Well, thank you, Michael. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
It's been nice talking to you. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye. You've been listening to the Stone Carvers Guild podcast. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you will find us online at stonecarversguild.org. There you can find photos showing some of the things that we discussed today, additional information about our guest, and if you're so inclined, ways to get more involved with the Guild and our ongoing activities. And of course, if you've enjoyed this podcast, we hope that you will subscribe and rate us on the podcaster of your choice. 5 stars, please. We'll be back in a month with a new episode, so until then, keep your hammer up and your chisel sharp.